You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. Joining us now to share her expert insights on the Madigan trial that has been going on for over a month now up in Chicago. It's Hannah Meisel with Capital News Illinois. Hannah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Cole.
So you are at the press room at the courthouse right now. You just finished up day 30. What day was it today?
I think technically today's 26th of testimony. We've been here 7 weeks of testimony, 2 weeks of jury selection before that, though. So I've permanently moved in.
Yeah, so just take me through it. Obviously, this case is incredibly intricate. We've had the court documents for so long now. We saw the way the feds were laying out their case, but it's a totally different animal for them to be laying it out in testimony and laying it out to a jury in this way. What has that been like for you, somebody who's been following this for so long?
Yeah, I mean, those indictments and pretrial motions that lay out certain evidence can only really scratch the surface. Sitting through the whole trial, the hundreds of recordings, the thousands of emails, the hours and hours of testimony from dozens of witnesses, it really just takes you inside certain moments in a way that you could never understand the nuance of just from reading. I've also, sat through 3 other related trials at this point, the so-called ComEd 4 trial last spring, or in 2023, the trial of Madigan's former chief of staff last summer, the AT&T trial a few months ago. So a lot of this Madigan trial has been repeat evidence and witnesses, but there's still just so much I've learned from a second go around. There's, people will say different things. There's different lawyers, they'll ask different questions. It's been very fascinating.
What really has stood out to you the most about this? Not the key piece of evidence, I guess, but really more so just like what are you learning the most about in this trial?
Yeah, I think I've been most struck by seeing glimpses into how government works behind the scenes. And I really mean that on 2 levels. Of course, the first is hearing conversations powerful people in Illinois politics and government, including Madigan, were having when they assumed no one else was listening. What gets a lot of their time and attention? What are they concerned about most at the end of the day? And for Madigan, of course, that was keeping his position as House Speaker and protecting those closest to him. But I've also been fascinated by the sort of breadcrumbs that have been dropped throughout the trial that explain how the Fed's investigation into Madigan unfolded. We've known for a long time that the FBI probe actually dates back to more than a decade ago, involving a real estate developer who'd been caught committing fraud. He then wore a wire on Chicago Alderman Danny Solis, and what he found was enough for the feds to request wiretaps on Solis's phone in 2014, 2015. Eventually in 2016, the FBI knocks on his door, asks him if he wants to cooperate. He spends the next 2.5 years basically working undercover, starting with recording against his colleague, powerful longtime Alderman Ed Burke, who, similar to some of the charges in the Madigan case, sought introductions from big-time real estate developers for his property tax business. It wasn't even until Solis had been cooperating for a year that the FBI even turned their focus to Madigan, who had called the alderman out of the blue and asked about a real estate project. And agents basically told Solis to set a trap, I guess, for lack of a better word. And from there, the investigation just kept advancing. At some point, the government started looking into what they'd eventually allege as bribery from ComEd and AT&T. And then they would net themselves another undercover operative in former ComEd exec Fidel Marquez, who we heard from earlier in trial.
We know the Fed's argument. We know the prosecution. We've been hearing the testimonies. There's a jury in that room. There's a jury of Madigan's peers that both sides are trying to win over. And when it comes to a jury trial, there's often this element of depicting the defendant a certain way. And Madigan, that's kind of been the story of his life in Illinois politics, at least, really being painted. The nickname, the Velvet Hammer, comes to mind, and you start to see this depiction of this larger than life figure in Illinois politics. And I'm curious how that's kind of juxtaposed for you, and now seeing him just in the courtroom, as being a part of these proceedings. And how is the defense maybe trying to combat that image in this way?
has been viewed in this kind of cartoon villain sort of way, larger than life. And the feds definitely leaned into that sort of image in their opening statements, whereas the defense, painted him as an everyman. Of course, he's not. No one can be in power as long as Madigan has without, certain characteristics. Madigan has talked about, many times publicly, the way that his German and Irish upbringing, shaped him as a person. He's very disciplined. He's very, he's very quiet. He speaks, or he thinks before he speaks. But the defense has been, a lot of these recordings, the tapes, the wiretaps, a lot of the Q&A from prosecutors goes like this. You'll play a tape and then the prosecutor will say, go back to the transcript and say to the witness on the stand who, most recently, most consequentially was Danny Solis, and say, what did you mean here? And, or what did you understand him to mean there? And so, Solis will say, well, this is where, I offered a bribe to Madigan and, this is where he accepted and so, but, a lot of these things, the prosecution is asking the question because, the jury is not supposed to jump to any conclusions. They're not supposed to interpret things themselves. But a lot of these tapes, it's just natural, normal conversation. Things can be left up to interpretation. So the defense seizes on that opportunity to, view things in a much, in a light that's not so sinister. And, this idea that this is just normal politics and this is just how things work. And this is just how Madigan talks. He's from a, different generation. It's been, they're really reasonable people really can interpret these things differently.
Madigan's indictment and really the federal probe in general into the Capitol was really it started the whole conversation around ethics reform in the Capitol, and your mileage may vary on how much you actually like and how much was actually done in the way of ethics reform in this building. But I'm curious, we've heard yourself and the other court reporters in the courtroom have done a good job of really pointing out when those breadcrumbs kind of fall into names that we know here in the Capitol. We've heard House Speaker Chris Welch a few times. We've heard Governor Pritzker. Most recently, I believe this week, there was talk of a list of recommended hires that was sent to Governor Pritzker. I'm just curious how you see that maybe bleeding over into the conversation here in the Capitol. We're about to come back for that spring session. Do you see those kinds of, that spotlight, that unusual transparency into how the Madigan operation worked, playing a role in some of these discussions in the Capitol?
Well, listen, I think that, people are always going to want to have more conversations about ethics reform, and that's a good thing. Those should happen. But, I think that when we're looking into a microscope at the events that happen in, over a 10-year period, the last, 10 years basically of Madigan's time in office. And you're looking into a microscope and if people are so myopic and focused on that, they're going to miss the fact that a lot, he's not the only person who did these sorts of things. Like recommending people that a new administration would hire to staff up. It's, you hire thousands of people in a new administration. That's much more than he did that. The defense has, where they can, pointed out, for example, that, Republicans, many people recommended names to ComEd to hire. And so, I think that one of my favorite phrases that I've learned that I find most useful in my kind of book of cliches is culture eats policy for breakfast. And you can legislate ethics rules, but it's really the culture. And what I mean by culture is the people. And a lot of the people who have been wrapped up in this investigation because it's been, the probe has spread wide, and, it had caught, other state senators, state representative in its kind of grasps. Those people are gone. And so, you should definitely be on the lookout, but hammering constantly on ethics legislation without, real ideas for why it would be effective behind it, it's gonna eventually fall on deaf ears.
Before we go, Hannah, I want to talk to you more just to get an idea of the work that goes into covering a trial like this and covering all the trials that you've covered before. I don't know your official title with Capitol News Illinois, if it is courts reporter or maybe just corruption reporter at this point with the amount of work you've been putting in up at that courthouse. But what is it like for you? How do you go about keeping all of this information, not only just in your head and make sure you're reporting all of this accurately in a way, but also just making sure you're keeping that larger context and allowing the everyday person to be able to understand what's happening in there?
Well, you have to type very, very fast. Recording is not allowed in federal courtrooms in general. And, so I have very long documents of all of my notes. I try to keep exhibits, other evidence straight, files on my computer. But it does help that I, have walked the halls of the Capitol for almost 11 years now. And I understand how, a bill becomes a law in Springfield. And so I'm able to decipher between when, either a prosecution or a defense attorney says something that's a little bit off and that, kind of misrepresents the process for their own kind of ends. And so, most of all, though, I'm fascinated and I feel very, I feel privileged to be here, and I feel a big responsibility too.
All right, well, Hannah, I'll let you go, hopefully to get some sleep and recharge for the next week here of this trial. Again, you can find Hannah's extensive coverage on CapitolNewsIllinois.com, and she'll be continuing to turn out those daily stories. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.